Hey everyone, tonight we begin with the fascinating lives and quiet strength of medieval peasants. Everyday people who, against the odds, managed to make it through some of the coldest and harshest nights in history, from basic insulation methods to group sleeping habits. Their story is one of creativity, endurance, and sheer will. Before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always interesting to see how far this community reaches. Now, lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for a soft background sound, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When we picture medieval life, we often think of knights, grand banquets, and lively fairs. But for the average peasant, winter wasn't a festive time. It was about survival. It wasn't just a season. It was a yearly challenge, like a harsh teacher who didn't offer second chances. Imagine living in a small hut made of mud and sticks, with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze outside. No insulation, no real windows, just a small hole covered with animal skin and definitely no heating system. The temperature inside your home was usually just a few degrees warmer than whatever was happening outdoors. If it was freezing outside, it was just slightly less freezing indoors. If you were lucky. Nights were the hardest. The darkness felt endless. Wind screamed outside like an angry spirit, and the fire in the hearth gave off a weak glow, barely warming the toes of whoever sat near us. If you were across the room, it wasn't much better than sleeping outdoors with worse snacks. Clothes weren't much of a help either. Peasants didn't have fur coats or thick blankets. They wore a couple of rough wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled faintly of goat, and hoped that layering would keep them warm. Spoiler: it mostly didn't. Forget cozy bedding. Beds were often just sacks filled with hay or straw, sometimes with dried plants for added padding and a few fleas thrown in for good measure. The cold wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and even freezing to death were real threats, especially for children and the elderly. Every morning, waking up still breathing was considered a small victory and, honestly, something to be grateful for. Maybe you'd even reward yourself with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, getting through a medieval winter wasn't about staying comfortable. It was about wearing everything you owned, sharing body heat with your animals, and hoping you didn't wake up with icicles on your eyebrows. And that was only the beginning. If you think your apartment feels cold because the window doesn't seal right, medieval peasants would probably disagree. Their homes weren't just drafty. They were more like enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof on top. Most peasant houses were made using what historians politely call wattle and daub. In simpler terms, branches woven together like a giant basket, then covered with a mix of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. Not to be gross, it was cheap, sticky, and always available. But even the most carefully patched walls didn't hold up well against a real winter storm. Cold winds slipped through every crack and gap, circling around the one-room house, making sure no one got too warm. Privacy didn't exist. Warmth was rare, but it definitely built character. As for roofs, thatched ones may have looked nice, but after months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and sometimes let in animals. Nothing quite like a squirrel landing in your stew to liven up the evening. If there were windows at all, they were tiny and covered with animal hide or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even rich landowners might only afford a small pane or two. As for peasants, they just hoped the wind wouldn't tear the cowhide right off during a storm. Floors were often just compacted dirt. During heavy rain or snow, mud would seep through the ground, so technically, yes, they had indoor water features. Not that anyone appreciated them. In winter, walking across your own floor could feel like crossing a frozen swamp. Cold above, cold below, cold all around. It was a full-body attack on your warmth. But medieval peasants weren't ones to complain. They stuffed cracks with moss, filled drafty spots with old cloth, and huddled together for warmth. Human insulation at its best. A mix of creativity, persistence, and maybe some sheep fat rubbed into the walls was often the only barrier between them and turning into human ice pops. If your house was falling apart and your best insulation was made of mud and goat hair, well, at least you could try to laugh about it, as long as your teeth weren't chattering too hard. And just when you thought the cold air was the biggest problem, there was another thread from below. The frozen ground. Floors weren't really floors. Back then, just slightly flatter dirt. Maybe someone had scattered some straw or rushes to create the illusion of comfort. But the reality was, you were only one thin layer away from hard, cold earth. That cold crept upward like a ghost, moving through the straw, into your bones, and deep into your body. Drop anything on the floor during a winter night, it probably froze right where it landed and became part of the landscape. Peasants tried to fight this in a few ways. One was laying down thick straw mats. If you could afford them more quietly, borrow from a neighbor. Field you might build a decent insulating layer. But straw flattened fast, got moldy even faster, and added a crunchy soundtrack to your already uncomfortable night. Some homes used dried rushes instead. These were layered on top of the dirt floor. And over time, more were added without removing the old ones. This built up a mix of rotting plants, fleas, and whatever else moved in. It was like a medieval version of carpet padding. If the carpet was damp, slightly alive, and smelled like wet fur, beds, for those lucky enough to have them, didn't help much either. They were simple wooden frames filled with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of soft mattresses, people slept on lumpy, shifting piles that didn't stop the cold creeping up from the ground. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a constant shuffle to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't beat the cold ground, they just got used to living uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep didn't mean dreams or softness. It meant waking up with all your toes still attached. If you managed that, you were doing better than many. If any part of a medieval home could be called a hero during winter, it was the hearth. This stubborn little fire pit was the only real line of defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of peasant life. At the center of most homes was a simple fire. No fireplace, no chimney, and no fancy stonework, just a pit or stone pile, a few half-burned logs, and a lot of smoke. There wasn't proper ventilation either. Most homes didn't have chimneys, so smoke drifted out through small holes in the roof or gaps in the walls or stayed right there in the room with you. Breathing wasn't ideal, and it probably didn't help anyone's health. But at least the smoke kept away fleas and other bugs. Who needs pest control when you're surrounded by smoke day and night? The hearth did more than just heat the room. It was where meals were cooked, where light came from, and sometimes where the family gathered to talk, share stories, or just stare at the fire since there wasn't much else to do after dark. Letting the fire go out overnight wasn't an option. That was an invitation for the cold to move in. Starting a new fire in winter wasn't easy either. No matches, just flint, steel, dry kindling, and a lot of patience. Every family member had a job. Keep the fire alive. Tending the fire meant watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or if you were fortunate, a rare piece of dry wood. It was a constant struggle between human effort and a freezing cold that always seemed ready to win. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, surviving was nearly impossible. It was a smoky, unreliable, and often underwhelming little fire, but during a medieval winter, it was the heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was the fire going out overnight. Without that flickering warmth, the cold crept in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the middle of winter, starting a new fire from scratch wasn't just annoying, it could be like there were no matches, and certainly no lighters. Getting a fire going meant striking flint and steel, hoping for a spark, and gently nursing it with dry kindling if any was left. Now imagine doing that while half asleep, in the dark, with frozen hands. Add a distant howling wall for extra motivation. So peasants got clever. They banked the fire, not in a savings account. Of course, firebanking meant covering the glowing embers with a layer of ash before bed. The ash worked like insulation, keeping the coals alive just barely until morning. Done right, you could walk over at sunrise, poke the pile, add fuel, and have flames again without freezing first. Done wrong, and mornings became much colder and far more frustrating. Firebanking was a skill passed down like a family recipe. Everyone had their own tricks. Some swore by dry ash. Others believed slightly damp ash worked better. Some packed the coals tightly. Others let them breathe. You could easily start an argument just by suggesting a different method. It was like debating cooking techniques, except the stakes were warmth and survival. Of course, banking the fire wasn't foolproof. A gust of wind might sneak through and put it out, or a clumsy sheep might knock over the hearth. Yes, that happened. That's why families often took turns getting up at night to check the coals. Think of it as the medieval version of adjusting the thermostat in your sleep. In the end, firebanking wasn't about controlling nature. It was about buying a few more hours of precious warmth. And if you woke up to a single glowing ember, that was your win for the day. In medieval times, the phrase, "the more the merrier," wasn't just for parties. It was a real winter survival strategy. When the fire got low, and icy wind blew through every gap, the best source of warmth was each other. If that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your family, neighbors, livestock, and possibly a confused goose, so be it. Forget personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't rest, it was not freezing to the floor. Whole families gathered in the warmest part of the house, wrapped in every bit of fabric they could find, forming what was best described as a snoring, layered group of humans. Young children squeezed between parents, grandparents tucked into the outer corners, and if Cousin Ethel arrived unexpectedly, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you slept in the center, warmed on all sides. If not, you ended up on the edge, the medieval version of sleeping beside a freezer door. And heaven help the person who moved too much during the night. One wrong turn, and you'd accidentally push Aunt Maud into the draft by the wall. Congratulations. Now you're the family villain. Sometimes even the bedding was shut, a single straw mattress slowly flattening under several generations. But when frostbite was the alternative, you didn't complain. Body heat wasn't just helpful, it was part of the plan. Some medieval guides even advised placing the strongest and warmest people on the outside, like human barriers against the cold. Babies and older family members were tucked safely in the middle, precious sources of heat to be protected. This wasn't just about survival, it became part of everyday life. Cold nights spent, bundled together, meant stories, songs, and many muffled conversations under a shared wool blanket. So the next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog takes over the bed, just remember, at least you're not trying to sleep between a snoring uncle and a suspiciously judgmental goat. If you think modern roommates are tough, medieval peasants would like you to meet their winter companions. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything warm and alive. Bringing animals indoors wasn't a strange village habit. It was essential. Livestock gave off body heat, and in a home where the wind was often louder than your hunger, every extra degree counted. Plus, if your goat was inside with you, it was less likely to get stolen at night. Two problems solved with one very smelly solution. At night, homes turned into crowded heating systems. Chickens settled in corners, pigs grunted near the fire, and cows relaxed by the walls, calmly chewing as if they helped pay the rent. It wasn't pleasant. Imagine being trapped in a car for hours with someone who hasn't showered. Now replace that person with a cow, add winter, and remove any chance of leaving. The smell, unforgettable. By spring, the scent of a shared winter was strong enough that no candle was needed. Junos had already gone on quite the journey. Still, peasants learned to ignore it. They knew one thing for sure. More animals indoors meant warmer mornings and fewer frozen toes. Certain animals got the best spot. Cows, being the largest and warmest, usually took center stage. Goats stayed close for their heating, because goats are stubborn and would come in anyway. Chickens perched in rafters or baskets. Pigs, they picked their spot and didn't care where. It was probably the middle of the room. Of course, sleeping near livestock had its downsides. You might be woken up by a chicken in your hair, or step into something unpleasant first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings were full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, smells, and random kicks from hooves, peasants accepted the deal. Cold could kill and cows, whether they liked it or not, kept people alive. When it came to winter clothing, peasants didn't worry about fashion. They focused on survival. They weren't chasing trends. They were preparing for a daily battle with the cold. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Often, all at once. Start with a scratchy linen under, then a wool tunic, and maybe a second if you had one. Add some saggy wool leggings, a rough cloak, and if you were lucky, a patched sheepskin tossed over everything like a prized reward. Now, you were about 10% warmer and a lot itchier. Boots were rare. Most peasants wrapped their feet in old rags or cloth and shoved them into wooden clogs. If that didn't help, they added more cloth and hoped for the best. Washing these clothes, not really an option. Doing laundry in winter meant breaking ice, soaking your clothes in freezing water, and waiting days for them to dry if they didn't freeze solid first. So most people skipped it. Smelling like smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price for not freezing. Strangely, the dirt and oil buildup had a benefit. Insulation. That layer helped trap heat. It was like a medieval weatherproof jacket, just smellier and not great for making friends. Hats, scarves, and gloves were precious. A wool cap could mean the difference between making it to morning or waking up with frozen hair. Gloves were homemade from scraps of leather or fabric, often more like odd sock puppets than real gloves. Kids were wrapped up until they looked like stuffed turnips, waddling around the house. The goal was simple. Keep in as much body heat as possible. Style didn't matter. Warmth was the real status symbol. So next time you're layering for a cold day, remember, medieval peasants wore half their closet every day and felt lucky. In the medieval world, dirt wasn't just something to clean off, it was part of the plan. Getting dirty wasn't a failure. It was smart. Winter had one main problem: losing heat. Clean clothes, especially newly washed. Linen did a poor job of keeping you warm. Sure, they were breathable, but when the temperature dropped below freezing, breathable wasn't helpful. That's where dirt came in. As peasants went weeks without washing, their clothing built up layers of sweat, oil, and grime. That grime filled the tiny gaps in fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval insulation, natural, effective, and a bit smelly. Sure, you might smell like a goat that lost a fight, but you were warm. Some even believed that washing too much in winter could make you sick, so they kept their protective dirt layer intact. Bathing was rare. Laundry, even rarer. Soap existed, but was saved for special events like when an important guest arrived or, occasionally, right before death. Instead of changing clothes, peasants just added new layers on top. Over time, people became walking reminders of their past. 6 weeks each stain with a story. To outsiders, peasants may have seemed like they gave up on hygiene, but peasants knew that grimy tunic was protecting them from frostbite. It wasn't stylish, but neither was freezing because you wanted to smell nice. And since everyone smelled equally bad, no one really noticed. Being nose blind was just how life worked. So yes, in medieval winter, dirt wasn't defeat, it was defense. If you had a thick, greasy layer by February, you were doing things right. If you imagine medieval peasants sleeping under warm blankets and cozy beds, think again. The real picture was much more rough. Sleep on a pile of old plants and hope for the best. Beds were usually simple, wooden frame sif. You could afford one with sacks filled with hay, straw, or rushes. No foam, no springs, no comfort, just a lumpy pile that smelled like a barn and disappointment. Every time you moved, the bed made crunchy noises, and a sharp stalk might jab you in the back. Some skipped the frame and put straw directly on the floor. What today might be sold as earth-connected sleeping, if rebranded by influencers, The straw beds were also temporary. Over time, they flattened, grew mold, attracted bugs, and became a health hazard. Changing the straw was a big deal. Some did it a few times a year, others only when the bed started moving on its own. Rushes were another option, long grasses, mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to cover up the smell of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled nice for about a day. After that, they became part of the messy floor, blending with dirt, crumbs, and whatever else ended up there. Fleas, lice, and other pests loved these beds just as much as people did. If you woke up scratching more than sleeping, you were living the true medieval life. Still, those messy piles of straw they added a layer of insulation from the cold floor. And if you piled in with others, shared body heat helped too, like medieval central heating. So the next time you stretch out on your soft mattress, remember, somewhere in the past, a medieval peasant is silently judging you, smiling with missing teeth and thinking, must be nice. When you live in a house made of mud, sticks, and hope, winter breezes aren't just a bother, they're a full-on threat. Medieval peasants didn't only fight the cold outside, they battled it inside their homes. Walls cracked, mud wore away, and the thatch roof sagged. The cold always found a way in, slipping through new gaps, each night like an invisible guest. So sealing the home became a skill. Moss, straw, old cloth, dry grass, even animal hair. If it blocked wind, it got stuffed into a crack. Some added more mud and dung to the outside as a yearly winter chore. Imagine standing in the cold, smearing manure onto your house, telling yourself, this is fine, this is comfort. Roof leaks were another constant problem. Thatched roofs didn't hold up well over time. Holes were patched with old rags, bundles of reeds, or in desperate moments, chunks of turf taken from nearby fields. Eventually, every roof started to look like a patchwork project, made by someone who gave up halfway. Doors and windows, if you had them, were basic wooden planks held together with nails and willpower. Windows with tiny holes, often covered with animal hides or cloth soaked in fat to block the wind, plus a bonus scent of mystery. Keeping warmth inside the home was a constant battle between human creativity and the persistent cold. One moment you felt fine, and the next, a sudden gust found the one gap you missed, reminding you just how cold it really was. Still, through resourcefulness, determination, and a strong dislike of being even slightly frozen, medieval peasants patched and pushed through winter, one muddy repair at a time. When the cold was too harsh to sleep through, peasants had a solution. Give up on the idea that everyone sleeps at once. Instead, they developed a system that would impress even the most disciplined army, sleeping in shifts. It wasn't a planned-out operation with signals or routines. It was basic, practical, and entirely necessary. Half the family stayed up to manage the fire and block new drafts. The other half curled up under thin blankets on hay, hoping for a few hours of rest. The fire needed attention all night. Left alone, it would fade. And restarting it wasn't simple. It took time, skill, and a bit of luck. So everyone took turns. You'd sleep for a while, then get nudged awake to take over, stumbling to the hearth to poke the embers, and try not to trip over a sleeping animal. It wasn't glamorous. There were no modern comforts, no snacks, and certainly no snooze button, just sore joints, tired eyes, and growing frustration with whoever snored through your shift. Children old enough to help were expected to take part. Winter survival was a shared responsibility. Even the elderly helped when they could, often staying near the fire longer, partly due to their experience, and partly because getting up and down wasn't easy. When it was your turn to sleep, peace was rare. People moved around, animals stirred, the wind rattled the walls, and someone always rolled into your space. Still, despite the interruptions, the system worked. With someone always watching the fire, the coals stayed alive, and so did the family. So the next time you complain about getting up to adjust the thermostat, remember the peasant squinting into a smoky hearth at 3 a.m., wondering if warm toes were really worth it. You know, it's truly cold when you have to think about how to breathe. Peasants didn't just deal with the chill through clothing and fire stay. even adjusted how they breathed. Why? Because breathing through the mouth pulled freezing air directly into the lungs. And in a time when illnesses like pneumonia were serious and often deadly, that was a risk no one wanted. So they practiced what we might now call survival breathing. Slow, shallow breaths through the nose were the goal. This helped warm the air slightly before it entered the lungs. Not perfect, but it lowered the chances of getting sick from cold air. If you took a deep breath through your mouth, you might end up with a nasty cough that stuck around for weeks. With no doctors nearby, treatment came down to hot onion tea and hopeful prayers. Some people even pulled part of their cloak or scarf over their face while sleeping, creating a makeshift barrier to trap some warmth. Of course, this meant waking up with damp cloth stuck to your face, but that was better than freezing your lung. Children learned these habits early. Parents corrected them for breathing too heavily indoors in winter. Between strict rules, itchy clothing, and the occasional gassy goat nearby, winter built a special kind of childhood toughness. At night, buried in straw bedding and surrounded by blankets and animals, breathing became something to do carefully. Slow, quiet, and always through the nose, like a chilly version of meditation, without the calm. It wasn't a dramatic survival tactic, but it worked one quiet breath at a time, helping peasants last another night. In the long, hard winter months, peasants found an unexpected tool in their fight against the cold. Turns out, staying warm wasn't just about what you wore, it was about what you ate. A full belly helped keep your body warm. Digestion created internal heat, and the more effort your body made processing food, the more heat it generated. So, before bed, peasants aimed for heavy meals that took time to digest. What was on the menu? Thick stews filled with root vegetables, like turnips, onions, and grains like oats, barley, and rye bread were common. On special days, maybe after a festival or a successful hunt, a piece of salted meat or sausage made it into the pot. These meals weren't fancy, just large, warm, and filling. It was all about calories and staying warm through the night. Foods high in fat were especially valued since they burned slowly and kept your body warmer longer. A meal of stew, dense bread, and maybe some lard. That was top-tier winter comfort. Parents didn't let picky eating slide either. Even if a child didn't like turnips, they had to eat them. Shivering through the night changed most minds. Of course, big meals came with side effects. Strange dreams were common as your stomach tried to deal with everything you just ate. But the trade-off was worth it. Better warmth, better chances of making it through the night. It wasn't about dining well. It was about staying alive. If survival meant sleeping full, breathing gently, and lying beside a cow, then that was just what you did. Two of their favorite tricks, the hay box and the heated stone. The hay box was simple but smart. A wooden box packed with hay worked like insulation. Cooked food like porridge or stew was placed inside and covered up. Hours later, it was still warm. No extra fire needed. Think of it as an early slow cooker. But peasants realized that if hay could trap heat from food, it could also work with other warm things like rocks. Before bedtime, someone would place a stone in the fire. Once it was heated, not quite glowing, but hot enough, it was pulled out using sticks, old tools. The hot stone was wrapped in cloth or placed in a clay pot, then slipped under the bed or down by the feet. Just like that, you had your own heating pad. There were risks, of course. Wrap it poorly, and you might start a fire. Drop it on your foot, and you'd add a new injury to your winter list. But when done right, the stone gave off hours of steady warmth. Not fancy, but in a freezing hut, anything that helped you sleep warmer felt like luxury. In the long list of survival tools, a warm stone and some hay might not seem special, but to a peasant trying to sleep through the cold, it was priceless. In a medieval peasant's life, the hearth was more than a fire. It was a part of the family. It wasn't perfect. It smoked, needed constant care, and didn't always do its job, but it was essential. Sleeping near the fire increased your chances of waking up without frostbite. That meant sleeping arrangements weren't random. The most vulnerable babies, elders, the sick got the warmest spots. Everyone else spread out around them like layers of insulation. A spot near the fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic survival strategy. Babies were fragile, but gave off warmth, and elders held family knowledge. Keeping them closest to the heat wasn't optional. But it wasn't all cozy evenings by the fire. Get too close, and you risk waking up with singed hair or a scorched cloak. Too far, and you might as well be sleeping outside. It was a careful balance. Stay close enough to feel the warmth, but not so close that you ended up explaining why you smelled like roasted vegetables. The fire's heat didn't spread evenly. It mostly warmed those directly in front, while everyone else huddled nearby, fighting for their share like cold lizards chasing a sunbeam. If you managed to fall asleep facing the fire, you'd enjoy one warm side and one frozen stiff enough to knock on. Animals, of course, joined the crowd. A dog might squeeze in between you and the flames, tail wagging dangerously near the embers. Chickens sometimes perched on warm stones nearby, quietly clucking through the night like small, feathery guardians. Every crackle of wood and soft hiss of embers was a quiet reassurance. You're still warm, still here, for now. And so, peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, the air frosty enough to see each breath, their dreams dancing just outside the fragile ring of firelight. It wasn't perfect, or even comfortable, but it was enough. Life clinging to warmth, one small fire at a time. In medieval times, no one made it through winter alone, lest they planned to become a very scenic statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family effort, it was a village mission, a noisy, muddy, sometimes chaotic collaboration, where everyone's survival depended on shared effort. Peasants knew that, even with a strong fire and a pile of hay, you could only do so much. If a neighbor's hearth went cold, people noticed. If no smoke rose from old Tom's roof, someone checked on him. Not just because he still owed you a chicken, though. Maybe that too, but because community meant staying alive. Villagers often had informal winter watchers, older folks, or younger kids, now work in the fields, keeping an eye out for coughs, absences at market, or homes to still on a frosty morning. They were the neighborhood patrol of their day, minus reflective jackets, plus lots of sheep. If someone's fire went out, it was serious. No one was too young or too tired when winter arrived. It wasn't generous. Because they had plenty, it was survival shared among all. A helpful neighbor would show up with a glowing coal wrapped in rags or offer a corner of their already crowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing more people into tight spaces, but that was better than finding them frozen in spring. Communal food stores mattered too. During harsh winters, villages might share their last bits of dried meat, grain, and root vegetables. Even children had roles, gathering firewood, sharing embers, or carrying messages. Sure, medieval villages weren't always peaceful. People argued over land, goats, or borrowed cooking pots, but when temperatures dropped, grudges were often quietly ignored. Because even your least favorite neighbor was worth saving. You might need saving too. St. Nicholas, long before his modern legend, was asked to shield homes from collapse or hunger. In the dead of winter, the village became one stubborn, often funny, but determined family, united by survival. Moving forward one muddy boot, one glowing coal, one frozen grin at a time. When winter's grip tightened, peasants didn't just rely on cloaks and fire, they leaned on faith. Because when wind tore at the walls and the fire shrank to faint embers, you needed every bit of help you could get to even divine. I'll be nicer to my neighbor, even if he did steal our turnips. They didn't pray for luxury, just for survival, for warmth, for a bit of food, for spring to come. Faith wasn't just for Sundays, it was part of everyday survival. Before bed, families knelt in smoky rooms, whispering quick prayers, for the fire to stay lit, the roof to hold, and their limbs to still be there come morning. Saints weren't just distant figures, they were protection. Saint Blaise was called on for throat issues, a real danger when one icy breath could bring illness. Not just one or two lives, but whole families. Sometimes entire villages disappeared beneath snow and silence. Superstitions were part of survival. Some sprinkled holy water by the hearth, hoping it kept away evil or at least the cold wind. Families huddled together in the dark, hoping for warmth that never came. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after feast days, asking for warmth and good luck to come inside. Special candles, sometimes blessed by a priest or the most devout neighbor, were left burning through the night, a flickering line of defense against the darkness. Smoke-filled homes turned into traps for illness, pneumonia, bronchitis, worse, and of course, there were the whispered promises. Please, God, just one more night. Faith wasn't about comfort, it was a daily, urgent plea. Some made it through missing parts of themselves. A grim survival badge. I lived but winter took a piece. And often, that hope thin but determined was what carried them through the worst nights. Despite all their hard work, faith, and clever tricks, sometimes the cold still won. And when it did, the cost was high. Some winters were especially cruel, like the Great Famine of 1315. Endless rains ruined crops. Animals starved. Cold turned daily struggle into disaster. People became so desperate. Stories spread of chewing leather, bark or worse. Losing the fire wasn't a small problem. It meant death. Neighbors, come spring, might find homes silent, with frozen bodies still clinging to each other for warmth. Roofs sometimes gave way under ice or snow. A collapse in the night was often fatal. Even reaching out for help through snowdrifts didn't guarantee safeties, especially if your neighbors were barely hanging on themselves. Disease also thrived. Hunger weakened by. They believed that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help them tomorrow. A cough in December could mean a burial in January. And frostbite fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died. Yet maybe the most chilling part wasn't the loss. It was how common it was. People expected it. They didn't cry out. Why? They just wondered who'd be next. Even so, they kept going, grieving, hoping, surviving. Because as long as there was one glowing coal, one breath in the air, there was still a chance. When we picture medieval peasants cold, tired, covered in mud, it's easy to focus only on their suffering. Likely arriving around 1501 at either Hever or Blickling Hall. She was the daughter of Thomas Bull, a determined diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman from a well-connected family. In the grand world of Tudor society, Anne's birth caused little stir. Yet from these quiet beginnings, a life was unfolding that would eventually reshape English history. But beneath all that struggle was something far stronger. Resilience. They had no heating, no down coats, no soft mattresses, often no certainty. They'd see spring, but they adapted. They learned. They helped each other. Every hay bed, every sealed wall crack, every saved ember was a small victory. Their communities weren't just for farming. They were built to survive. They watched over the sick. They shared food when there was barely enough. Their faith wasn't just belief, it was survival in spirit. Hope wrapped in smoke and straw. A hope that spring would return, that life would go on. And somehow it did, because they endured. They kept going, and through all of it, bit by frozen bit, they moved humanity forward. The warmth we take for granted now, the blankets, the heated homes, the calm evenings with tea exist because of them. So next time the wind taps at your window, remember those who faced winter with nothing but grit, prayer, and each other. The nameless ones who left behind a quiet but powerful legacy, one ember, one breath, one unbreakable heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn was not born into power or privilege, likely arriving around 1501 at either Hever or Blickling Hall. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a determined diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman from a well-connected family. In the grand world of Tudor society, Anne's birth caused little stir. Yet from these quiet beginnings, a life was unfolding that would eventually reshape English history. From early on, Anne stood out not because of wealth, but because of her intelligence. She was bright, confident, and by most accounts, naturally charming. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her abroad, where her real education began. First, she served at the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a rare opportunity for an English girl. There, Anne learned diplomacy, refined social skills, and gained early exposure to the complex world of European politics. But it was in France where Anne truly developed. She spent years in the cultured courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, picking up not just fluent French but also a deep understanding of social influence, charm, and subtle persuasion. While others practiced embroidery and practiced conversation, grace, and the art of holding a room's attention without appearing to try. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne had become something unique, a woman who could match the sophistication of European courts and still carry the ambition of a rising English family. She wasn't considered classically beautiful leaven. Her admirers admitted that, but she was captivating. Her dark eyes showed intelligence, her voice was lively, and she moved with purpose. Even under layers of courtly etiquette, Anne didn't just enter a room, she changed the energy in it. In an era where most women's futures were shaped by birth or marriage, Anne had other ideas. She had seen firsthand the power that charm and intellect could hold in foreign courts. Now, she was ready to use those tools at home. Still young, still unproven, Anne Boleyn was already becoming more than Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was stepping into a larger role, one that would soon reach the crown itself. When Anne returned to court, she stood out immediately. In a world filled with modest, fair-skinned English women, Anne was something else, entirely like a thunderstorm among spring breezes. Her dark features and sharp mind made her different from the quiet and obedient ladies around her. She began in a traditional role, maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in that position, Anne drew attention. She danced with poise, spoke fluent French, and carried herself with confidence rarely seen among women at court. Men noticed, women whispered. The court buzzed quietly about this striking Boleyn girl, but for long, Anne caught the attention of the most powerful man in the country, King Henry VIII. Henry was no stranger to flirtation. The court was full of secrets and romance, but Anne was different. She didn't melt at his compliments or rush into his arms. She was playful, cautious, and firm. This intrigued Henry, a man used to instant admiration. The more Anne kept her distance, the more fascinated he became. They exchanged letters full of emotion, longing, and frustration. Eventually, Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, an unofficial position of great influence. Amazingly, Anne declined. She refused to be another passing favorite. If Henry wanted her, he'd need to make her queen. It was a bold move, especially since Henry was already married. Catherine of Aragon was deeply respected and supported by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church would need to be defied to make an acquaint, but Anne didn't back down. She had spent years in European courts, where queens wielded quiet influence behind fans and smiles. She understood the risks and the rewards. In the candlelit court of England, Anne made a decision. She would not settle for admiration. She would change her fate and the fate of England itself. What started as a flirtation quickly turned into a national crisis. Henry wasn't just interested in Anne, he was consumed. And for her, he was willing to change everything. The problem, he was already married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and strong, refused to step aside. She had been Henry's wife for 20 years and remained popular among the people. In both public opinion and church law, she was the true queen. Divorce wasn't just controversial, it was nearly impossible. But Henry pushed forward. He convinced himself and tried to convince others that his marriage had been cursed because Catherine had once been married to his brother, although the Pope had approved their marriage years earlier. Henry now claimed that his soul was in danger unless it was annulled. Anne, meanwhile, stayed distant but strategic. She kept Henry hopeful but didn't give in. Every move was deliberate. She wasn't just aiming for marriage, she was setting herself up to be queen. The court divided. Some families backed Anne, hoping to rise with her. Others stood by Catherine, disturbed by the idea of Anne replacing her. Letters flew to Rome. Foreign rulers made threats. Even Henry's advisors hesitated, sensing the danger. As time passed, Henry grew more frustrated. He sent endless requests to the Pope. He pressured lawyers to find legal paths, and he started to realize the church would not bend. Catherine's family, especially her nephew, Emperor Charles V, stood firmly in her defense. Still, Henry moved ahead, ignoring advice, traditions, and eventually, the law. Anne was no longer just a romantic interest. Her relationship with Henry had become a symbol of rebellion, a challenge to the very foundation of England's political and religious structure. She wasn't simply winning a king's heart, she was reshaping the kingdom itself. After nearly 7 long years of uncertainty, scandal, and political upheaval, Anne Boleyn's gamble succeeded. In January 1533, she married Henry in secret, even though legally he was still married to Catherine. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been her moment of triumph, but not everyone celebrated. Many Londoners watched in silence. Some cheered, others quietly prayed for Queen Catherine. To them, this new queen, with her foreign manners and bold style, was a troubling sign of change. Anne didn't become queen as a national favorite. Unlike Catherine, who was known for her humility and religious devotion, Anne was ambitious, sharp, and unafraid to lead. She wore rich colors, used her influence openly, and quickly made enemies. Her position, though powerful, depended on one thing: producing a male heir, and understood this deeply. She was no longer just Henry's partner, she was the future of the Tudor dynasty. When she became pregnant, both she and Henry believed it would be a son. But in September 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Anne handled the disappointment with composure, promising that the next child would be a boy. Henry, however, was visibly shaken. His faith in Anne began to waver. Still, for a time, Anne remained at the center of power. She reshaped the court, elevated her family's status, and became the first queen to be crowned with a sacred oil, usually reserved for kings. Her influence extended across borders. Foreign diplomats sought her approval. Political alliances were adjusted to match her favor. Henry, determined to protect her position, broke fully from Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England. This move ensured that Anne's crown couldn't be challenged by religious authorities. But even at her peak, dangers loomed. Friends turned cautious. Enemies watched closely. And Henry, restless as ever, had begun to look elsewhere. The brilliant woman who had once reshaped the kingdom for Henry was no longer enough. Anne had reached heights few women of her time could imagine, but the higher the climb, the harder the fall. Almost from the moment she wore the crown, her world began to crack. At the center of Anne's troubles was the pressure to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, though healthy and bright, was not the son Henry had hoped would secure his dynasty. Time was running out, and experienced several pregnancies in quick succession, but each ended in miscarriage. The losses left her physically weak and emotionally drained. With each child lost, the foundation she had built grew weaker. Henry, once deeply in love, began to drift away. His disappointment drove a wedge between them. Anne, never one to remain silent, argued and pushed back. But Henry, who valued obedience as much as beauty, began to lose patience with her strong-willed, same quality that had once drawn him in. Outside their private life, her enemies gathered. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise now openly plotted her fall. Supporters of Catherine of Aragon had never forgiven Anne. Commoners still whispered against her, blaming her for the break with Rome and the difficult reforms that followed. Then came Jane Seymour, quiet, modest, everything Anne was not. As Anne's influence faded, Jane caught Henry's attention. Where Anne had challenged him, Jane offered comfort. Anne saw the change and tried to hold on, giving Henry attention, promising sons, asking for more time, but his eyes were already elsewhere. Her political enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, once her saw the shift. They began building a case against her. quietly gathering rumors and false witnesses. The woman who had once navigated court politics so well was losing her ground. Anne had gained her crown through ambition and intelligence. But in Henry's court, past success meant little. Only continued power kept you safe, and hers was fading fast. The Queen who had changed England would soon be the one changed by it. Anne Boleyn's enemies didn't need weapons. They used secrets, lies, and whispered schemes. In private rooms, betrayal was quietly taking shape. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally in the reform of England, now turned against her. Their goals had shifted. Anne wanted change to help the poor and reduce the power of corrupt nobles. Cromwell wanted order, the king's approval, and no interference. Anne's boldness became a threat, and Henry's love had become cold suspicion. Anne's few real allies were gone. Her charm, once so effective, now irritated a court eager for a softer queen. Jane Seymour, waiting quietly in the background, was the perfect contrast to Anne's fading influence. Cromwell moved first. He knew Henry wanted out but needed a reason. Divorce would embarrass the king. Disgrace would end things cleanly. So, Cromwell proposed an accusation. The claims were extreme: adultery, incest, plotting against the king. And once a proud queen was now painted as a traitor. Cromwell gathered evidence, much of it forced under torture. Men were arrested, including Anne's brother, George. The charges made little sense, full of errors and contradictions. But in Henry's court, the truth was whatever the king needed it to be. Anne saw what was happening and tried to appeal to Henry's memory, their past. But he would not even look at her. In May 1536, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the gates closed behind her, she understood. She was no longer a queen, but a prisoner in the same game she had once mastered. Betrayal had decided her fate in the Tower's great hall. Anne stood before a jury of nobles, many who had risen thanks to her. Now they judged her, silent and unmoved, ready to erase her from power. The charges were shocking: adultery with several men, including her brother George Boleyn, and high treason. In another time, such claims would have been unthinkable. But now, they were just part of a performance meant to provide the king with a legal cover for what was already decided. Anne defended herself with the same clarity and strength that once won Henry's heart. She denied every charge with confidence and calm. She reminded the court that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen and anointed as queen. She spoke of her loyalty, her sacrifices, and her love. It didn't matter. The decision had been made before the trial began. Witnesses, some bribed or threatened, gave statements. Their stories didn't match. Evidence was weak or missing entirely. But the outcome was fixed. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men were sentenced to death. Anne was to be executed by beheading, a small mercy compared to the usual traitor's punishment. When the verdict came, she did not break. Her face was pale, but she stood tall. She said she was ready to die and asked God for mercy. After the trial, Anne returned to the Tower, not as queen, but as a condemned prisoner. Yet she stayed strong. In the Tower, she spent her final hours in prayer. She asked forgiveness for those who had harmed her, and perhaps for her own pride and ambition. She didn't confess because she believed she was innocent. She wasn't afraid to die, she said, but she hoped her death would bring peace to the kingdom and perhaps protection for her daughter, Elizabeth. Her loyal ladies-in-waiting cried in private, but Anne comforted them. Her dark humor still showed. She joked that she would be remembered as the queen who lost her head. Henry VIII showed no sign of regret. He had already begun preparing to marry Jane Seymour, even before Anne's execution was scheduled. That final betrayal may have been the hardest of all. On May 18, 1536, Anne learned she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. She prayed, instead asking for peace, forgiveness, and strength. Henry arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, considered quicker and less painful than an axe. A small mercy likely meant more to ease Henry's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, she dressed with care, a dark gray dress trimmed in fur, with a red petticoat underneath. She pinned up her hair and prepared to meet her end with dignity. In the Tower courtyard, Anne Boleyn, Queen Mother, survivor, stepped forward. There were no tears, no pleas, only calm acceptance. Her final act was one of courage. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn stepped onto the scaffold inside the Tower of London. A quiet crowd gathered. The air was still. Even the stone walls seemed to wait. Anne stood tall in her gray gown, the wind gently lifting the fabric. She looked tired but calm. She didn't cry or tremble. Instead, she spoke clearly, choosing her last words with care. She did not accuse anyone. She did not beg. She prayed for the king's well-being, the man who had once loved her and now condemned her. In those last moments, Anne gave the world not a confession, but forgiveness. The executioner from France stepped forward and knelt, hands folded, her eyes turned toward the sky. A cloth was tied over her eyes. The sword moved once, quick and silent. Anne Boleyn, Queen Mother, a woman who had once changed the course of history, was gone. She was buried quickly, without ceremony, in an old chest, because no coffin had been prepared. A queen crowned in gold, laid to rest without a proper grave. But her story didn't end there. Her daughter, Elizabeth, a child who once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, would lead England into a golden age of power, culture, and exploration. She would inherit her mother's intelligence, determination, and courage. And in that way, Anne Boleyn's legacy would live on, not in titles or thrones, but in the strength of a daughter who proved that one woman could change the world. The final deadline had arrived. Under British law, tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If not, customs officials could seize the cargo, and British troops could be called to enforce the law. Everyone knew the stakes. If the tea was brought ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists allowed it even once, their claim to rights and freedom would weaken. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and nearby colonists filled the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some had walked for miles through the cold countryside to attend. The meeting was so crowded that people spilled into the streets, trying to hear the passionate speeches echoing from inside. Samuel Adams, a strong voice for resistance, led the meeting. One by one, speakers rose to oppose the Tea Act, denounce British rule, and call for action. But even in the middle of this protest, uncertainty remained. What could they do without starting a war? How could they stop the tea without bringing harsh consequences? As the afternoon went on, riders arrived with serious news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to change his position. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading. The tea would be taken, the tax collected, and the king's law enforced. The crowd grew tense. The meeting house shook with energy. Then Samuel Adams quietly said, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." A simple sentence, but everyone understood what it meant. No more talk, no more petitions. Action was coming. Outside, a war cry cut through the air. That was the signal. Men quickly disguised themselves by smearing soot on their faces and throwing on blankets and feathers, loosely copying Mohawk warriors. It wasn't to trick anyone. It was a symbol, message of unity and determination. The deadline had passed. Boston would now respond, not with words, but with action. As night fell over Boston on December 16, 1773, movement stirred through the darkened streets. Ordinary men, dressed in rough blankets, with darkened faces and feathers, headed toward Griffin's Wharf. There, the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver sat anchored. The harbor was cold and quiet, the winter air sharp. This wasn't chaos or a riot. It was a planned, focused act. The men carried hatchets and clubs, boarded the ships, and quickly took control. The crew wasn't harmed. Sailors stood aside and watched as the protest began. The men split open the tea chests, the scent of fresh tea filling the cold night air. Crate after crate was dumped into the harbor 342. In total intel, the water was dark with loose tea. Onlookers watched silently from the shore. British guards nearby made no move to stop it. It's unclear whether they were unsure, sympathetic, or afraid of making the situation worse. Some reports suggest even loyalists recognized something important had changed. The discipline was clear. No cargo was stolen. No ship was damaged beyond what was needed. Only the teethus symbol of unfair rule was destroyed. In a city struggling with hunger and poverty, these men could have used the moment to take what they wanted, but they didn't. When the task was done, the harbor looked like a giant teapot, full of broken crates and floating tea leaves. The smell of salt water and steeped tea hung in the air. The men left quietly, disappearing into Boston's alleys and side streets. They didn't give their names or claim credit. They left only one clear message. Resistance had taken a new form. As the last crates drifted in the water, Boston fell silent. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot or an accident. It was a deliberate act of protest, carried out with control and purpose. The next morning, the smell of tea still hung in the air. Word spread quickly through conversations, letters, and newspapers. By midday, everyone knew what had happened. Reactions split. Among patriots, there was pride that ordinary people had stood up to the most powerful empire in the world. But for loyalists and moderates, there was alarm. Destroying property, even for a cause, seemed reckless. Had the colonies gone too far? Governor Hutchinson was furious, not just at the damage, but at what it meant. If the king's rule could be ignored in Boston, where else might it be challenged? British officials were shocked. They had expected protests or boycotts, maybe another riot. They had not expected an organized and disciplined effort to destroy royal property without any chaos or looting. That the captains of the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver watched helplessly as their valuable cargo was destroyed. Official reports listed the loss at over £10,000, a huge amount. But the greater loss wasn't money or tea. It was trust. It was the belief that the colonies still accepted British rule. That night, as tea sank in Boston Harbor, something else surfaced. A clear truth. The time of peaceful protest was ending. A major conflict was on the horizon, and Boston was ready. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, the response was fast and angry. To British leaders, this wasn't just protest. It was open defiance, a direct challenge to royal authority that demanded a strong answer. King George III, upon hearing the news, reportedly grew cold with anger. Parliament, already tired of years of resistance from the colonies, erupted in outrage. They wanted punishment, not just for Boston, but to send a message to all the American colonies. The result was a series of laws, so severe they were soon called the Intolerable Acts in America. The first blow came quickly. The Boston Port Act. In a single harsh move, Parliament ordered the shutdown of Boston's busy harbor, the city's economic lifeline, till the destroyed tea was paid for, and order restored. Ships could no longer come or go. Trade stopped. Goods and supplies disappeared. Boston, once full of activity and noise, became quiet. Its docks stood eerily silent. But the punishment didn't end there. The Massachusetts Government Act took away the colony's right to govern itself, placing control in the hands of royal officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried back in Britain, a clear sign that they were above the law. To show they were ready to use force, British soldiers were stationed across Boston, living among the very people they were sent to control. The message was clear. Rebellion would be crushed. Freedom was no longer something the crown would accept, but Parliament's harsh response had the opposite effect. Rather than scaring the other colonies into submission, it outraged them. News of Boston's suffering its port closed. Its people living under martial law sparked sympathy and anger. Throughout the colonies, wagons full of food and supplies arrived from neighboring colonies. Letters of support and promises of unity followed. Secret meetings began bringing the once divided colonies closer together. What had started as Massachusetts' problem was quickly becoming a shared American struggle. Britain had hoped to make an example of Boston. Instead, it made the city a symbol, a call to resist. The spark of revolution, once limited to a few places, now began to spread widely. it would not be easily put out. The punishment of Boston sent shockwaves far beyond Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, anger turned into something more serious: unity. For years, the colonies had acted more like distant relatives arguing and competing, divided by distance, religion, and trade. But when Parliament closed Boston's harbor and took away its self-rule, people everywhere realized it could happen to them too. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, from South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response came quickly. Colonists sent food, supplies, and messages of support to Boston. Town meetings were filled with frustration. Newspaper presses worked non-stop to spread the news. The fight was no longer just Boston's, it belonged to everyone. So in September 1774, something new happened. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered to plan a united response. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, once known mostly in their own regions, now came together as leaders of a growing movement. Their official goal was not yet independence. Most still hoped for peace and a return to respectful relations under the British Crown. But beneath the calm discussions and formal letters, a deeper understanding was forming. The colonies could no longer afford to remain divided. At the Congress, they agreed to a wide boycott of British goods. They promised to support each other if Britain took further action. And they made it clear: an attack on one colony would be treated as an attack on all. In taverns and meeting houses, everyday people began to speak openly of ideas once whispered: unity, resistance, and freedom. By punishing Boston, Britain hoped to stop rebellion. Instead, it helped create something stronger: a group of people who, despite their differences, began to think of themselves not as separate colonies but as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer just blowing, they were building into a storm, and Britain could no longer stop it. The night the tea was dumped into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just the crates that sank. It was the idea that the colonies would remain loyal forever. The Boston Tea Party sparked a fire no king, army, or distant government could put out. In the months that followed, that fire spread. What had been protests, boycotts, and polite petitions turned into open resistance. Militias began training in the open. Storehouses were filled with gunpowder and weapons. Men who once praised King George III now talked of revolution in the same taverns. Boston became a symbol of sacrificed, damaged, but determined. The more Britain tried to tighten control, the more the colonies pulled away. Every ship that passed the still, silent harbor of Boston was a reminder that tyranny had met strong opposition in American defiance. When Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, they meant to scare the colonies by punishing Boston. Instead, they created a city that inspired unity. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists now saw their futures linked. Resistance had grown beyond TIT, was now about freedom, identity, and survival. By spring 1775, tensions reached a breaking point near Boston, in the towns of Lexington and Concord. British troops sent to take colonial weapons were met by armed farmers, ordinary men, ready to defend their rights. The first shots of the American Revolution were fired. Connected directly to the night tea was poured into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party showed that revolutions don't always begin with grand speeches or banners. Sometimes they start quietly, with a small group of people choosing defiance over fear. That night, the colonists rejected not just a tax but an empire. The path ahead would be long, violent, and uncertain. But after that night in Boston, one thing was clear: the colonies were no longer just British subjects. They were something new, something powerful. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started. Long before the pyramids of Giza, before cities rose in Mesopotamia, and before Stonehenge stood in England, there was Carroll, hidden in the dry valleys of coastal Peru. Carroll rose nearly 5,000 years ago, then vanished, forgotten, and buried by time. For centuries, no one knew it had ever existed. The Soup Valley, where Carroll once thrived, seems like an unlikely place for a city. The land is dry and barren. The river is a narrow silver line winding through dust and stone. To most, it looked like a place where nothing could survive, but it was here, in this harsh land, that one of humanity's earliest cities was built. Carroll was not just a group of huts or a trading post. It was a planned city, spread over 150 acres. It had pyramids, plazas, homes, and ceremonial spaces. It showed vision, purpose, and structure developed centuries before Egypt began building its own pyramids. The people of Carroll did this without the wheel, without writing, and without metal tools. They built with stone and earth, using only their creativity, teamwork, and determination. Yet for thousands of years, no one knew this city had ever existed. Travelers who passed through the area saw only wind-shaped hills. They believed these were natural formations, not the remains of an ancient city. No one guessed that under the sand lay one of the world's first urban centers. Older than the civilization's history, had long considered the earliest. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologist Ruth Shady and her team uncovered the truth. What they found in the dust changed the way we think about the history of the Americas and the beginnings of human civilization. Carroll had risen, thrived, and disappeared in complete silence. Now, its stones speak once more, telling the story of a peaceful and intelligent people who built a complex society in a place where life itself seemed nearly impossible. Asterisk, and this was only the start of their story. At first glance, the Soup Valley looks like a place where nothing should live. Dry winds blow over endless fields of stone and sand. The sun beats down hard, drying the land and cracking the earth. Water is scarce, and the river is just a thin line struggling to flow. To the untrained eye, it looks empty, lifeless, and forgotten. But the people of Carroll saw things differently. They didn't see a desert to fear. They saw a landscape they could shape. They viewed the river, though small, as a source of opportunity. With patience, creativity, and determination, they transformed this harsh land into a thriving center of life and culture. Their first success was agriculture. They learned how to manage the seasonal floods, building simple yet effective irrigation systems that spread water across the valley. Where others saw dry earth, they grew new life: cotton, beans, squash, guava, and sweet potatoes. Cotton became especially valuable. It was used to make fishing nets and cloths, supporting trade with coastal villages and forming strong connections beyond their desert home. But growing crops was just part of their knowledge. The people of Carroll knew that living in the desert required balance. They worked with nature, not against it. Their homes and public spaces, made from stone and earth, were built to handle both extreme heat and the occasional heavy rain. They studied the skies and the seasons, timing their harvests like skilled astronomers. Trade was at the heart of Carroll's economy. Goods like dried fish, cotton, fruit, and handmade crafts moved along the coast. In return, Carroll received rare items, colorful shells from the Pacific, stones from the Andes, and ideas from distant cultures. They were not isolated. They were connected. In a place where survival seemed unlikely, Carroll succeeded through intelligence, innovation, and cooperation. They didn't force the desert to change. They learned from it, respected its power, and built a society that was not just practical, but exceptional. Against all odds, Carroll grew into a sign of early civilization, and it was only beginning. Rising from the desert like silent watchers, the pyramids of Carroll challenge our ideas about early American civilizations. These weren't small or crude structures built by unskilled hands. They were large and carefully designed buildings, created by a people with planning, organization, and purpose. At the center stood the pyramid, the largest of Carroll's structures. It stretched more than 450 feet long and rose almost 60 feet above the desert. This was a major achievement, equal to the early wonders of the world. Built from stone, mud, and bags of rocks wrapped in reeds, it was designed not only for the climate, but also to survive earthquakes. And it did, standing through thousands of years of weather and time. But unlike Egypt's pyramids, Carroll's Pyramids weren't used as tombs. Instead, they were places for ceremonies, leadership, and community life. Temples and open spaces were built on top, reached by wide staircases. Fires once burned there, and rituals were performed under the open sky. At the base, large circular plazas allowed thousands of people to gather for religious events, political meetings, and public celebrations. The layout of the city showed a focus on community and structure. The people of Carol were closely tied to each other and to the world around them. Homes and smaller buildings surrounded the pyramids, likely where priests, officials, artists, and farmers lived. The pyramids were carefully placed, possibly aligned with the sun, stars, and solstices. For Carol's people, building was more than just construction. It was spiritual, scientific, and connected to the universe. Walking among the ruins today, it's hard not to feel a sense of respect. These structures were built without metal, tools, without wheels, and without animals to carry loads. Yet they show balance, scale, and precision. Carol's pyramids weren't built for power or war. They were made to connect the earth and sky, people and nature, time and belief. They still speak today, telling a story that history nearly forgot. There is something unique about Carol's, something that makes it different from many ancient civilizations. No weapons have been found in the ruins. No walls surround the city. No mass graves suggest war or violence. Unlike other civilizations built through conquest, Carol grew through peace. It's a surprising truth. This society did not depend on armies or battles. It grew through cooperation, trade, and shared values. The people of Carol focused on building, astronomy, music, and social life, not warfare. Their public buildings weren't monuments to victory, but places of worship, decision-making, and gathering. They chose to come together rather than fight, to solve problems through exchange rather than destruction. Trade was key to Carol's success. Cotton grown near the river was turned into fishing nets and traded with coastal groups. In return, Carol received dried fish, a vital food source, sand, rare goods like shells from the Pacific, stones from the mountains, and tropical fruits from faraway valleys. This trade network brought many communities together in peaceful cooperation. Carol became the center of it, a cultural and economic hub. Religious and ceremonial life helped maintain unity. The city's plazas likely hosted rituals that brought people together under shared beliefs. Music was central to these events. Flutes made from condor bones and drums from deer hides created rich soundscapes that echoed across the desert. These gatherings connected individuals to something larger. Leadership seemed to rely more on spiritual guidance and organized planning than on military strength. The leaders of Carol likely managed major building efforts, farming schedules, and trade, without leaving behind signs of conflict. In a time often marked by war, Carol stands out as an exception. It shows us that civilization can rise through cooperation, creativity, and trust, not only through force. The stones of Carol still seem to carry the sound of a forgotten time. Carol was more than just a city of structures and trade. It was a place filled with sound, ceremony, and spiritual meaning. Music and ritual were central to its identity. Archaeologists working in the sand have found many musical instruments: flutes made from bird bones, whistles shaped from antlers, and small drums made from animal hides. These were not toys. They were carefully made, tuned to specific pitches, and designed to carry sound across the city's open plazas. In a world without writing, music was how people shared emotion, memory, and belief. Imagine it. The low beat of drums at sunset, flutes echoing in the wind, feet moving across the plazas. As people gathered beneath the sky, fires lit the tops of the pyramids. Priests in woven clothes called out to the gods of nature, the river, the land, the stars. In those moments, Carol became more than a city. It became a living performance. The layout of the city shows that rituals were at its heart. The wide plazas weren't just open areas. They were designed for shared ceremonies. The sunken circular courts acted like early theaters, focusing attention and sound on the events held at their center. Above them all, The pyramids stood not as tombs, but as part of this living, spiritual world. But these pyramids were like sacred mountains, shaped by human hands, linking the earth to the sky. Rituals likely followed the seasons, marking, planting, harvesting, and celestial movements. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a bridge connecting people, nature, and the divine, the known and the unknown. Asterisk, asterisk, there are no violent murals, no terrifying war gods, and no signs of bloody sacrifice. At Carol, the spiritual world appears to have been one of balance, joy, and respect. Even now, when the desert wind passes through the ruins, you can almost hear it, the faint echoes of ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty and meaning in a harsh and endless landscape. Carol was more than a place of music, trade, and ceremony. It was a work of engineering, a clear example of human skill in one of the world's toughest environments. Without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals, the people of Carol built a stone and earth city that has lasted nearly 5,000 years. Their work was remarkable. Huge pyramids rose from the desert, made not of small bricks but of massive stones carried across the dry valley. Workers used reed bagstrong, woven from local plants, to move heavy rocks. They built carefully, layer by layer, filling the structures with rubble to help them survive both time and nature. And they understood nature well. Carol sits in an area known for strong earthquakes, yet many of its pyramids and plazas remain mostly intact. Why? Because they mastered earthquake-resistant design. Builders used flexible methods, wide bases, layered fills, and rounded corners to help absorb and release seismic energy. This knowledge didn't come from books, but from direct observation and understanding of the land. Water use was another quiet success. Though they lived in a desert, the people of Carol built complex irrigation systems. Channels and canals directed river water to their fields, making farming possible even in dry seasons. No water was wasted, every drop counted. Carol's layout also showed smart planning. Large structures were aligned with key points in the solar calendar, suggesting a deep awareness of the sun and stars. The sunken plazas, with their precise geometry, served not just as gathering places, but likely as tools for tracking the sky, helping priests and astronomers predict seasons, which was vital for survival. Asterisk, asterisk, the city's layout also reflected a complex society. Homes, administrative buildings, and ceremonial spaces were arranged in a way that balanced everyday life with spiritual needs. They built for the long term, for the future. Today, as engineers study Carol's endurance, they see a lesson. True achievement isn't only about advanced technology. Often, the greatest insights come from understanding nature and working with it, not against it. Carol's stone structures have survived storms, earthquakes, and time. They are a quiet monument to a people who turned dreams into stone. For hundreds of years, Carol thrived, a peaceful center of music, trade, and architectural skill in the desert. Then, almost without warning, it was left behind. There were no fires, no signs of attack, no mass graves or destroyed buildings. Carol simply faded. Its plazas emptied, its pyramids slowly covered by drifting sand, its instruments silenced by time. Why the people left remains uncertain. Some experts believe climate change was the cause. Evidence suggests a long drought may have damaged Carol's farming. Without enough water, crops failed. The trade that depended on surplus cotton and food may have collapsed. The balance Carol had maintained with its environment may have tipped too far. Other researchers point to changes in trade. As other cultures grew and new power centers developed along the coast and inland, Carol's influence may have weakened. Perhaps their main products, cotton, fish, produce were no longer enough to keep their role as a leading city. Slowly, the trade networks that supported them may have declined. Some suggest internal issues, perhaps political tension, religious shifts, or even a society worn out after centuries of effort. Even peaceful cultures can struggle when times become hard. Whatever the reason, the decline seems to have been slow. Families probably left gradually, searching for new lands, better rivers, or fresh starts. Children who once played in Carol's plazas may have grown up hearing stories about a city now left behind, stories that eventually turned into legend. The desert quietly reclaimed what humans had built. Wind carried fine sand over temple stones. Flutes and drums were buried beneath the shifting earth. A once lively city became a quiet field of forgotten shapes. For nearly 4,000 years, Carol stayed hidden, a faint memory beneath the dry earth. Travelers walked over rounded hills, unaware that one of the world's oldest cities lay below. These mounds, shaped by wind and time, were assumed to be natural. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Carol's story was rediscovered. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, following clues and a belief that the area held hidden history. What they found would change everything. Layer by careful layer, the sand was removed. Walls of stone, wide staircases, sunken plazas, and pyramids appeared. A city older than expected, older even than Egypt's pyramids, was uncovered. Carbon dating confirmed the surprise. Carol was over 4,600 years old, thriving during the same era as early civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that redefined archaeology. Until then, experts believed that civilizations in the Americas developed much later. Carol proved otherwise. It showed that complex cities, monumental architecture, and organized societies arose in the Americas on their own, long before the Incas or Maya. Shady's team uncovered more than just buildings. They found the remains of daily life, instruments, fishing nets, textiles, quipu ancient, not records, and offerings to the gods. Every item helped tell the story of a society built on intelligence, creativity, and long-term vision. Rediscovering Carol was more than just academic, it was a revival. A civilization buried for thousands of years stood in the light again. Its plazas, touched once more by wind and sun, whispered of music, trade, and people. Today, Carol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, rare and fragile link to humanity's early dreams of community, culture, and belief. The sand had hidden it well, but the stones endured, waiting for someone to notice, to remember, to understand. Now, Carol stands as a quiet giant, reshaping how we view the past. Its pyramids and plazas share a story that isn't about conquest or destruction, but about harmony, creativity, and hope. Long before the rise of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Carol were building something remarkable. They raised pyramids without wheels. They mapped the stars without writing. They built a thriving culture based on trade, ritual, and design without leaving signs of war. In a time often marked by conflict, Carol offers a different path, a vision of civilization focused on connection instead of conquest, wisdom instead of force. It reminds us that complexity doesn't require violence, and greatness isn't defined by armies, but by how people build together. Carol's influence reaches far beyond its desert home. It challenges old beliefs that civilization started in just one place, or that urban life began only in the old world. Carol proves that innovation and ambition arose in many parts of the world, different hands, same human dreams. Walking through Carol today, you can almost hear it, the soft beat of drums, the distant sounds of flutes, the voices of traders, the laughter of children under the stars. Their stories live on, carved into the earth. Carol teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit remains, buried under sand, waiting to be rediscovered, waiting to inspire once again. In the long story of humanity, Carol shines not as a relic of the past, but as a guiding light for the future. A reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wisdom, beauty, and peace can grow and reach for the stars.